So can I say welcome to everybody, and particular welcome to the friends and family of Tamzin and Hana. It's really nice that you've been able to join us tonight on what is a celebration of two amazing books. Can I introduce myself? I'm Annie Everall, one of the directors of Authors Aloud UK, who set up these events, and Naomi Cooper, who will give you a little wave, is my co-director. And the wonderful Bev Humphrey, who has switched herself off. She is our techie guru as well. And can I also introduce and welcome Louise Dickey from Penguin Random House, who is the publicist for this event. So welcome to you too, Louise. And I'd obviously like to welcome, and a big welcome, to our special guests tonight, Tamzin Merchant and Hana Tooke, who I think are two fresh, exciting new talents on the middle grade fiction scene. And as I said, tonight we are celebrating the publication of Tamzin's new novel, The Hatmakers, and the paperback publication of Hannah's book, The Unadoptables. Thank you, Tamzin. I've got a virtual background, so when I do that, my hands disappear. As usual with these evening events, we'll have a chat about the books and the author's writing journeys, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So pop your questions in the chat box, and then Hannah and Tamzin will answer them at the end. You are able to order a signed copy with signed bookplate of both books via the H&H Spalding order line, and I think Bev will put that into the chat box so that you can see that. And they are doing a special price for if you decide to treat yourself to both, which I very definitely would recommend. And I will introduce and welcome both Tamzin and Hana. Tamzin grew up in Australia and South Africa and Dubai before coming to England in her early teens, where I thought it was very amusing that she says she finally discovered the season of winter. And oh boy, we do get some good winters. Tamzin's an actor and an award-winning screenwriter. She starred in The Tudors as Catherine Howard, in Pride and Prejudice as Georgiana Darcy, in Salem and in Supergirl, and her latest role is as Imogen Spernrose in Amazon's Carnival Row, alongside Orlando Bloom and Carla Delevingne. She survived the Blitz in 1940. She succumbed to pneumonia in Edwardian times. She's been an alien, a witch, a doomed queen, and a rebel Scottish warrior. And you're looking very well on it, Tamzin.
Thank you. Multiple demises have done me some good things.
The Hatmakers is her first novel, but having read it, I really hope it won't be her last. Hana Tooke. Hana was born in Alkmaar, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, in the Netherlands, and in 1985. And then she moved to England in the late 1990s. And she now lives in Bath with a big human, a little human, and an even littler cat. And I found some fun facts about her. She used to have a pet water buffalo called Buffy. Her boss, and I can empathise with this, her boss is a cat called Moop, and she can summon Moop by whistling the Addams Family theme tune. She can cycle without holding on to the handlebars, and Hana is not actually called Hana. Her real name is Hanneke.
Oh, well done.
Is a Viking name, and therefore she thinks she's probably descended from Thor. Mm-hmm. She can't say the word effortlessly. So we're none of us to ask her that tonight, because we're going to be very kind. And she says that if Matron Gaspeak from the Little Tulip Orphanage were to introduce her as one of her orphans, Matron Gaspeak would probably do it like so. Hana, age 30-ish, likes cats and catnips, eats far too many stroopwafels, handwriting is acceptable, cooking skills are atrocious, but she can wiggle her nose like a bunny. Hana comes with odd socks and a blanket covered in cat fluff. So, two great authors, and can I start then by asking you what a fairly standard question about? Can you tell us a little bit about your background and your journeys into writing? I don't know who would like to go first.
Yeah,
I don't mind.
Okay, all right.
So I grew up in Holland. I started writing probably about 10 or 15 years ago. I can't remember how long ago exactly. But so The Unadoptables was kind of the book that I've been trying to sort of avoid writing for a few years. And the reason for that is that I've been writing all sorts of exciting adventure stories with Vikings, steampunk, but there was they just weren't really working. And the reason for that is because I tend to write stories that are kind of coming of age stories, which feature protagonists who are about 12 years old. And my experience of being 12 was not exactly ideal. It was when I'd moved from Holland to England. So I'd come from a very international school in Holland where it's called the European School. And essentially every single pupil within that school was foreign. So I kind of grew up in this world thinking that everyone was different. Everyone had a funny accent. Everyone spoke a different language. Everyone was basically very different. And so when I moved to Devon, rural Devon, at the age of 12, it was kind of the polar opposite of that. And there was quite a big culture shock there. So I kind of turned up at my new school. And just to clarify, I really do love Devon. I love England. But when I turned up at my new school, I kind of felt like I had broken some kind of all these sort of unspoken rules about what was kind of acceptable and what was not. So I had a really wonky leg. I was born with this hip condition where my femur was completely kind of mangled. And then at the age of 4, I went and got myself hit by a car, which didn't help, broke that leg. So I turned up with a really wonky leg. I had an unpronounceable name, although Annie, you pronounced it perfectly, Hanneke. And then I was foreign. And so I'd come from this school where where I was used to everyone being foreign, to this place where actually people weren't used to foreign people, and they just didn't know what to make of me. So first 2 years were very difficult and kind of trying to fit in, and I developed something called Selective Mutism, which is essentially where in certain situations you physically can't talk. So I was fine at home, I was fine with some of my friends, but especially in school, I physically couldn't talk. And this kind of lasted right up into my 20s. And ironically, at about the same time that I went mute, I discovered that I had a really nice singing voice, which I thought was just the most ridiculous thing the most ridiculous talent I could have developed. But it was also the kind of thing that kind of saved me. It kind of got me out of that selective mutism. So eventually I started performing about the age of 15. I went to a new school, started performing at my local pub, and I'd wear a hat over my head so I wouldn't have to see the audience. Or I would sort of turn around and face the drummer, which was also equally as awkward. But slowly I kind of came out of it. And so when I did an MA in writing for young people, and they were talking about how you should write what you know and think back to your childhood. And I was thinking, actually, 12 was quite awkward. I think I'd rather write about dragons and slaying monsters. But I kind of had this revelation that actually, even though that was quite a difficult period, I came out of it quite well. And, I love England, met loads of amazing people. I did a degree in music performance in the end. So I slowly kind of came out of that. And I thought, actually, that could be quite an interesting children's story. A kind of rags to riches story, but where the riches isn't sort of money orientated. It's more kind of like self-worth and how you get over feeling ashamed of yourself for things that you can't help, like a disability or being foreign, that kind of thing. And I found that the two things that got me out of that were choosing who I listened to, so whose opinions I held over others, and also embracing the things that kind of made me really peculiar, sort of embracing my weirdness. And so I woke up one day, I was on the second year of my MA, and I'd been writing this story about Vikings and magic, and my tutors thought it was all really exciting, but they were like, it's just not really, there's no emotional element to it at all. And I woke up with this fairy tale in my head where I had these 5 characters who were very, very vivid in my head, and they each had a kind of little aspect of what I'd gone through. But what they had was, which I didn't have at that age, was each other. So I thought it would be really nice to write a fairy tale, very Dickensian sort of fairy tale in this orphanage where these 5 children have been deemed too peculiar. They've kind of broken all the rules of what is acceptable and what isn't. But they have each other, and so they see each other's worth, and they constantly sort of champion each other. So every time the matron is cruel to them or says something nasty, it just doesn't land. And so I started writing that story, and it just poured out of me. I wrote it in about 6 weeks, the first draft, something like that. And that's kind of how I got to it. So I went from, I did music at college and at university. I then did some teaching, which I never thought I'd be able to do with my selective mutism, but I was really, really happy to do that. I did that for about 5 or 6 years, went into special needs, where I kind of learned about the phrase selective mutism. I hadn't actually known that was a thing until I read about it. And then I thought, yeah, you know what, I would quite like to write a story about this. So that's how I'm here.
Brilliant, thank you. How about you, Tamzin? What was your background and route?
Oh, that was so amazing, Hannah. Thank you for sharing all of that. That was really beautiful. Thank you. I don't really want to talk about myself. I just want to hear more about Hannah. It's funny, actually, when you were talking, I was thinking that, so I moved to England to boarding school from Dubai when I was 11. So we both arrived in England from somewhere quite international.
Isn't it?
Yeah, difficult age. And like, it was definitely a culture shock. I mean, obviously there was the winter shock, but also just the culture shock of being a bit different from everyone, and not really, like, I understood England as a summertime place where we'd come on holiday to escape like the terrible heat of Dubai. Yeah, but then it's interesting, and funnily enough, my lead character Cordelia is 11. And that's the age that I was moved to. So I'm suddenly piecing together some of my own psychology here.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? Writing is a bit like therapy. I found that with this book, actually.
Yeah,
Lots of people say that. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. And I think that I've tried to make Cordelia like my favored parts of myself, and so the parts of myself that I would like to be thought of, and I would like to be more like. So it's interesting that we both got our kind of lead characters are kind of aspects of our psyches in some ways, and that's really interesting. Wow, blown my mind there. And I've been writing. I remember writing at my desk when I was about sort of 5 or 6, probably, in little notebooks. Apparently, in fact, I do remember this. I would write a lot of stories about my pet hamster, whose name was Hattie. So it kind of all ties together quite nicely. Hattie the hamster, you know. Somehow I was already working on the hat makers at the age of 7 through Hattie. But basically, I would be writing stories and stories and stories about Hattie the hamster, and my teacher eventually kind of had an intervention with my parents where she was like, listen, there's too many hamster stories. She needs to break out. So I started writing about human beings, which was, you know, a step. And similar to you, Hannah, I had a dream, and kind of like I woke up with this very vivid idea of the hat makers. Just kind of the whole concept was fully formed in my head, and that was during filming of the show that Annie mentioned, Carnival Row, and I'd had a lot of costume fittings, and the night before I'd had this costume fitting where the amazing costume designer was talking about making a special hat for the guy who plays opposite me, David Jesse, who has horns in the show because he's a faun. And so she was talking about this special hat maker that was going to have to make this very special hat to fit over David's horns. And I had the dream that night. I dreamt about this family of hat makers who made special magical hats, and I woke up and and it was really quite fully formed in my head as well. So similar to you, actually.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
Apparently that's how David Almond wrote Skellig as well. It just kind of floated into his head one day.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, what a creepy thing to float into your head. Amazing, but like intense. Intense dream.
I mean, both books are sort of historical adventures blended with magic and fantasy. Yours is set in Amsterdam, and Tamzin's is set in London, both in the 19th century. And one of the things that really struck me when I was reading the books is that in both books, the sense of place is really very strong. For instance, it's about 25 years since I was last in Amsterdam, and yet reading the Unadoptables, I was instantly transported back there, and I had pictures in my mind's eye. And the same, you know, when you were talking about Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, and the images were so strong. How do you think you achieve that sense of strong sense of place in your writing?
I wrote quite a bit in Amsterdam. So that probably helped. I went and climbed around some windmills. I grew up on the polder. If anyone doesn't know what a polder is, it's essentially reclaimed land. Lots of canals, windmills. So that was kind of the landscape of my childhood, really. So yeah, it was really vivid, especially when you start thinking about being 12 again. You know, it was just.
Wow.
Yeah. What about you, Tamzin?
I mean, I think I would try and put myself like in the Theatre Royal Drury Lane and just try to imagine the details of what it would have been like. But I actually found this amazing map by John Rock from 1766, and it's in like the British Library Archives. I found it online, and so I really wanted everything to feel, when I was kind of describing Cordelia rampaging around London, I was kind of trying to make sure that it felt geographically real. So I traced her journey on that map a lot, which was so fun. And I did kind of, gosh, it does seem a long time ago that we were actually allowed out of our houses and allowed to just walk around the streets of the city. But I walked around London quite a bit and tried to kind of feel where the events were taking place and that kind of thing. But yeah, trying to evoke the past and kind of do it with sort of all five senses. That was a bit of a challenge. I don't know if you found the same thing, Hannah, because obviously neither of us have been to the 18th or the 19th century. But
yeah, I mean, I got my mum to do a lot of research, because trying to research things in Dutch as well, my Dutch isn't brilliant. So she did a lot of things like can you bury people on the polder, and all sorts of weird things that Googling for me.
She sort of calls from the Dutch police, just being like, "What? Google that."
I don't know. It's difficult. Look, I think being in a windmill, even like now, you go in and it just smells really kind of windmilly. I don't know how to explain it. Going into the covered beds as well, and you can't. I guess there's a few that you can visit in Holland that I did go and visit, which were still made up the way they would have been back then. I also went around an old orphanage in Amsterdam, the Kleine Weeshuis, which is set up, I think it's slightly earlier, so the 18th century. But you can go in and see all the pokey little rooms where all the crowded beds. They've got they used to have cows in the orphanage, which they would use for milk and things like that. So it's all kind of set up as a museum. So I did a lot of that.
I suppose like in some ways, some of those exciting things are kind of universal and timeless. So like going to the theatre or being in a windmill are kind of timeless, and the things that excited people back then about that experience probably are still the things that would excite us now. So I guess, I went to the V&A archives, which I highly recommend. You can just email them and ask them for a slot, and then you can basically request these amazing old things to be brought out, and they lay them on these big tables with sheets of white paper, and you're not allowed to touch them, and then someone comes and like turns these ancient hats over with white gloves. So that was cool to see artifacts from the time that actually the details kind of wove their way into the story from that way as well.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, both books, artifacts feature quite heavily in both books, so you can see where that's kind of permeated into the story. But I also I think the other thing that for me when I'm reading a book, the thing that I love to like the characters. You know, I kind of hook into the characters, and both books really made me love some of the characters, you know, particularly Cordelia and the 5 children, and great Aunt Petronella. But which of the characters did you enjoy most writing about? And you know, which character challenged you the most?
I feel like with the children, I mean, they do feel a bit like they were a bit of a Horcrux, each one of them for me. But I tried, so it was really difficult trying to sort of make them their own people as well at first. I had to kind of disentangle that element that I'd given them from me. So that I found that quite tricky. But I think the person I liked writing the most was actually Edda Finkelstein, who didn't come into the story until sort of draft 3 or 4. I had this in the middle of the story, just this very long tangent where they thought the owl was a poltergeist, and that went on for like chapters and I thought it was really funny. I was having a great time with it, but my agent was just not having it. I couldn't write, so I had to come up with a new character, and I thought, well, it needs to be. So I've got these really 2 grotesque villains in my story who kind of they sort of symbolize that nasty side of society that is very prejudiced and cruel. And I thought I wanted something that was the complete opposite of that. Someone who's, you know, who isn't afraid to push the boundaries of you know, that time. So Edda Finkelstein just kind of appeared again one day when I was trying to think of a character, and she just brought the book to life. So I think she's probably the one that I really liked writing, just because she really helped me out a lot with that story.
That's great. Yeah. She seems like a woman who could get a lot done.
Absolutely. You didn't mess with her.
Yeah, exactly. I enjoyed, conversely, writing the biggest, silliest man in the book, Sir Hugo Gushforth, the noble.
He's my favourite. He really is.
Amazing, yeah.
I really enjoyed writing him because, he is a very silly man, and he may or may not be based on several very silly people that I have known in my past. But it was quite fun to kind of, just go on that journey with Sir Hugo and see him get his trousers very much falling down, and then actually my boyfriend is one of Sir Hugo's greatest champions. Like, he really loves Sir Hugo, and this is probably a big spoiler. Well, not, it's a tiny spoiler at the end. So Hugo, when we meet him, he wants a hat to give him confidence on stage. And then the last time we see him, he's performing without the need of a hat. And that was Barney's idea. And I liked his little arc. So I did kind of, give him a little triumph at the end, but it was fun to put him through a bit of hell on the way there.
Did you find it hard to let go of those characters when you got to the end of the book, or did you feel like you could just release them?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I'm writing a sequel, so they're back.
Oh.
Yeah, no, I don't plan to write a sequel. So I kind of felt that was my therapy over when I got to the end of that. I was kind of sad, but kind of I feel like I left them in a good place. And there was a little side character in the book, the girl with the eyeball necklace, who was just a kind of minor character, who was quite intrigued by. So I she's actually the one that I've kind of focused on for my second book. I kind of wanted to find out a bit about her.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a link there.
Yeah.
Which is quite fun.
Well, I think you should at some point think about coming back to the next bit of the Unadoptables, because there were so many things that I want to know what happens next. But actually, in both books, there's a really important character. The Milu's father and Cordelia's father, who are absent really throughout the story. And that absence, for me as a reader, seemed to create a space for both Milu and Cordelia to develop as really strong characters in their own right. And was that a deliberate writing technique to help develop the characters, or was it more part of the dramatic narrative, really, that you wanted to create to give that emotional impact?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually had her father actually as her brother in an original draft, so it changed quite considerably. I don't know. I feel like I do want to revisit it. I don't know if I'll revisit it in an exact sequel, or if I'll do something a little bit more sneaky in a sort of side novel. But he is definitely a character that I feel there is a big story there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, for me, I definitely don't have a technique, really. So I didn't do it as a kind of deliberate decision to give her more space. But it's an interesting kind of thing that you see in a lot of, I guess, middle grade fiction, particularly, is like you see a lot of sort of children by themselves, kind of out in the world, kind of tackling it more or less for the first time by themselves, which is, I guess, it's a kind of part of the of how middle grade and young adult fiction kind of I don't know, is part of the coming of age.
Yeah,
it's an important part of it. I don't know what I'm trying to say there, but I think
they kind of need that freedom, don't they?
Yeah, they need the freedom from parents to kind of come to grips with the world on their own terms. And but definitely wasn't a deliberate decision, because I was sort of seeing how things went and just writing that as definitely part of the great mystery. I knew that there was a shipwreck in my dream. I was like, there's a shipwreck, which was part of the kind of the initial idea that came to me in the dream. And so I then sort of put Cordelia's father on that shipwreck, which felt like quite a natural, and it was always like that through every draft. So kind of part of the story, I guess.
Yeah, well, they were big characters, but not present, and it was an interesting way of developing the story, I think. So and kind of moving on from that, you both use magic and mystery in very creative but very different ways to bring your stories and the characters to life. And did you have a clear idea before you started writing of how you wanted to use magic, or did you let it evolve as the characters developed as you were following the writing process?
Yeah, I never sort of set out to have real magic in there as such. I wanted to keep it quite ambiguous, I guess. I think it's because I was trying to think of what it would be like in that age and what you would believe then. Even in the sort of 90s, I kind of believed in ghosts. I used to do seances and little Ouija boards in the playground. So I can imagine, back, 150 years ago or however long, even with science kind of making the progress, you've kind of got that confirmation bias. If you believe something already, you kind of look for instances. So I wanted to kind of keep it kind of ambiguous with Milu in particular, who's got this sense that she can sense danger with her ears, and there might or might not be a ghost responsible for that. But at the same time, she might just be really intuitive. I kind of wanted to leave that up to the reader to decide, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, that's so lovely as well, to kind of have all those elements and then let the reader almost, speak to them in their own way. It's really
Exactly.
This is one really for you, Tamzin, because the different trades of the makers are your magical creation, which spark, a lot of great ideas of how you can make different items for different purposes.
Yeah.
So why did you choose to put the hat makers at the heart of the story and central to the guild? Why not the glove makers or the cloak makers? What was it about the hat makers?
Well, I mean, that was how the dream was. So for me, like, it was kind of, I mean, can you tell I have no technique? I'm just like, it was the dream. But it was how the dream was, and because of the costume designer talking about making the hats. But I also think that hats are quite kind of timeless. Obviously, they're, this hat, for example, is a lot more old school. If I wore this walking down Oxford Street, I think I'd get a few interesting glances. But I think hats are quite timeless because we all, have at least one, I would hope. And so I think that hats really lend themselves to magic. And Uncle Tiberius says the head is where the thinking is done and the hat goes on the head. So that's pretty undeniable logic from Uncle Tiberius. But I think that it kind of, hats, you can really jazz them up and they can say a lot. It's like adding a bit of, your own unique kind of pizzazz on, kind of more than the other makers and the other, gloves or cloaks or boots. And I think probably that might be why the other makers are a bit jealous of the hat makers, even though they would never admit it. But I think hats have a particular kind of their own personality. So that would be.
No, I can see that, because you do. We ourselves, when we put hats on, don't we? We can, we can become somebody else.
They're quite transformational, really.
Yeah.
And in the Georgian times, a bit of research I did was, and I highly recommend it, Google Georgian hat satire. The cartoons, the satirical hat cartoons, are hilarious and brilliant. They're like these women wearing kind of entire fields of sheep on their heads, and or like ships, which is actually something that Marie Antoinette wore. And there's amazing cartoons of gravity-defying headwear creations out there.
And I mean, children reading your books will, enjoy the story on one level, but underpinning that, both books actually offers, I think, some quite important underlying messages about the role of girls and women, about the need to be brave and believe in yourself, and particularly about how families come in all shapes and sizes, and it's that sense of belonging, really. Did you sort of deliberately set out to put some of those messages in, or again, did it kind of evolve as the characters develop and the plot developed?
I think the whole misfit thing, I feel like, especially when I was that age, I was the ultimate misfit. And so I really did want to write a story about that. It took me a while to kind of work it out and how to do that. And the reason I chose a sort of fairy tale in the sort of 19th century, I guess, was for two reasons. I was very obsessed with Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist as a child. I learned the entire musical off by heart at the age of 4. And I'd perform it to anyone who would listen. And I also think, like, fairy tales, they're very universal. They kind of speak to that very sort of deep human aspect, in all of us. And I wanted it to be a story that anyone who has ever who has ever been bullied or ever sort of felt ashamed of their immutable characteristics, things that they can't help, would kind of connect with these characters. So I set out to write about a group of misfits who find their own way. They just refuse to let other people dictate how they should feel about themselves. So I think that was quite a driving force for mine.
Yeah. and it does come, the messages come through very clearly, but not in a preachy or negative way. It comes through in a very strong and positive way, I think.
Yeah, and I wanted it to be really exciting as well. I wanted there to be, lots of like a quirky plot, mystery. It's got puppets, it's got pirate ships, and I wanted it to be exciting as a story, but to have that kind of undertone of that kind of heart, I guess.
Yeah It's really good learning. Kids will learn through reading it, because you use a lot of Dutch words, and they just make you want to explore what those meanings are. They certainly made me look a few things up and discover the stroop waffle, what that was. I was very happy when I discovered they did gluten-free versions of them. So if what is it that you would like the child then to take away? What message would you like the child to take away from your book?
That being peculiar is a really good thing. It's what makes life interesting. It's what makes the world interesting. That's kind of what Edda sums up at the end as well. How we need more absurdity like that. And to choose, and to be really careful who you listen to, whose opinions you give merit to. I think that's the key thing, because I think that's I think we all kind of fall victim to that. In that, especially as a writer, you can have 1,000 positive reviews and you see one that says, actually, I found it quite boring, and you can just fixate on that. You focus on the negative, don't you? And it takes a concerted effort to not do that. So, yeah.
How about you, Tamzin? What would you like kids to take from your book?
I think that Prospero, Cordelia's father, says to her, we all have our own unique magic, and it's up to us to adventure into our heart and head and belly and find out exactly what that magic is made of. And that's what I like. And I suppose it's kind of a similar that message of your most magical self is your true self, and that I'd like for children to read it, and children of all ages, grown-ups as well, to read it and to feel that they have the power to discover their own magic. Because Prospero also says that no one's magic ever goes away, but sometimes it can be like a flower in winter and it disappears, but you can always wake it up again. So for me, that's really the heart of the story that I'd like people to take from it, is that we have our own magic, and that you can always discover what it is, and you can always wake it up again.
Well, we've been chatting. Can we, before I've got a few questions that have come in before this evening, and then we'll open it up to questions. But can you both give us a taste of it? Would you like to do a little reading each? And then we'll take the questions and then see if we can look at the trailers again. So who would like to read first?
I don't mind.
Okay, well, you go first.
Yeah, you go for it, Hannah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll go for it.
Oh,
okay. So that's fine. I'm going to read a few chapters in. So this is at a point where the children are in the orphanage. They've decided it's not safe for them any longer, so they need to escape. It's the middle of the night. There's a villain at the door, blocking their exit out the main door. So this one really showcases Lotta, who isn't the main character, but she's one of the side characters. She is the kind of sort of feminist engineer of the group. She's always got a very clever way of fixing things. So they hurried up the steep stairs. Malou grabbed the banister as she and Lotta skidded around the corner and thundered up the next set of stairs. The laundry room was lit by a thin column of moonlight streaming in through a broken slat in the shutters. It was a narrow squeeze past the tubs and tables to the small window. "It'll probably take two at a time," Lotta said, opening the window with an ear-splitting screech. The laundry bucket was already suspended over the other side, illuminated by the moonlight and swaying in the icy wind. "Egg, Fenner, you first." Egbert peered eagerly over the window ledge. He held a hand out to Fenner. "Ready?" The doorbell ding-dong, ding-dong, ding-donged. Rotman was going to wake the other orphans at this rate. Not that they would be brave enough to go and investigate. Fenner climbed up next to Egbert. The suspended basket swayed and the rope groaned. They climbed into the bucket together. Ready? Lotta said. Then she began turning the crank handle. Milou watched as the bucket descended with a creak, clunk, creak, clunk. She let out a long breath when it touched the ice, and Egbert and Fenner began to climb out. Lotta's arms spun quickly, the winch crank squealing as she wound it back up again. Sem peered nervously over the edge. But the canal? It's frozen, Sem, Lotta said impatiently. If it can hold 100 ice-skating families, it can hold 5 children. Sem climbed in, and Milou quickly followed, careful to keep her eyes only on the round bucket, ignoring the height and the biting wind that stabbed like an icy dagger at her exposed skin. See you in a minute, Lotta said. What about you? Milou asked. You can't operate the crank and lower yourself down. Lotta gave her a wry smile. I'll need you to unlatch the bucket and then attach the hook, nice and taut, to the railings on the other side of the canal, okay? But how? With a sudden, grinding squeal, the bucket began to lower, them down towards the canal. Sem's arms tightened around her so much Milou could barely breathe, but before she could wriggle free, the bucket hit the ice with a scratchy thud. They scrambled out, Sem's limbs tangling with hers, and unhooked the bucket. I hope she has a plan, Milou rasped, the cold night air catching in her throat. They slipped and slid across the width of the frozen canal. Fenner climbed up the stone bank first, pulling Egbert over the iron railings. Milou gave her the hook, and she clicked it onto the topmost rail, just as Lotta had instructed. Lotta was a dark silhouette in the laundry room window. Milou watched in awe-filled horror as Lotta reached up towards the taut line of rope, her hands wrapped in something Milou couldn't quite make out. Then she leapt into the air. A scream lodged in the back of Milou's throat, but she swallowed it down. Lotta knew what she was doing. Lotta always knew what she was doing. Her coat billowed out around her as she slid down the rope and glided over the canal like some sort of nightmarish wraith. Milou's swallowed scream resurfaced as a delighted giggle. Lotta was spectacular. She hurtled down towards them at a dizzying speed, and just as her grinning face came into view, she let go and dropped onto the ice. She landed, tangled in a mass of skirts and fur. Stupid dresses, she huffed as she straightened herself out. So impractical. Milou and Sem slid over to her and pulled her up. Are you all right? Milou asked. Lotta stood on shaky legs, her pigtails in disarray and a wet rag in her left hand. She nodded and threw the rag aside. A few streets away, a whistle blew, and then another. Rotman stopped ringing the doorbell, she said, her face turning serious. We need to run.
And if you want to know more, you're going to have to read the book.
That was
Over to you, Tamzin. Share a little bit of yours.
Okay, mine's not quite as exciting, but I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 4. For as long as Cordelia could remember, she had been helping her family with their craft. Before she could walk, she had crawled between the oak benches in the workshop, carrying ribbons and lace in her mouth. If they arrived a little damp, her uncle would patiently dry them by the fire before stitching them onto his creations. When she began to walk, she staggered across the trimming room with feathers for hats held carefully aloft. She toddled through plumes of steam from her aunt's hat blocks and tottered around eddies of crystal light swirling in the alchemy parlour. The first words she learned were written in spiky runes from the whispering books in the library. She made friends with the lush plants that burst from the glasshouse perched on the roof, became acquainted with the stars through her great-aunt's stargazing telescope, and gave all the quest pigeons names. She wrapped the moon cactus in a woolly scarf when there was snow on the ground, and cooled the Vesuvian stone with a fan in summer to stop it oozing lava onto her great-aunt's table. She knew the brushes that were brusque unless you talked to them politely, and she was the only one who could coax the Timor fern to unfurl a new frond by whispering kind things to it. The hat makers had lived in this house for more generations than anyone could quite remember. Magic from the ingredients, brought home from the adventures all around the world, had seeped into the grain of the wood and into the time-worn stones. The wrinkled glass of the old windows, the walls, and even the chimney pots bristled and shivered with their own eccentric magic. Some of the magic was rather exasperating. For example, if you trod on the workshop hearthrug in the wrong place, it would deliberately trip you up. One of the floorboards was very ticklish and tended to wriggle if you walked over it. Uncle Tiberius often got impatient with the cupboard where invisible things were kept. The door of the cupboard had slowly faded. From being inconspicuous, it had become obscure and then completely invisible. But when her uncle could not find it, Cordelia knew just how to squint at the wall to glimpse the handle. Useful around the house as Cordelia was, she was not actually allowed to make any hats herself. Ingredients are unpredictable, her aunt often warned her. They can be exceedingly harmful if used in the wrong way, and some ingredients should never be used at all. There we go.
They're great, and again took me straight back to reading the books for the first time. So thank you for that, because there's nothing like hearing the author read something from their own book. So at that point, as I say, I had some questions sent in from people who are here in advance of tonight. So I'll just ask you those, and then if anyone in our audience has a question that they'd like to make, do please pop them in the chat box. But Rachel asked, how do you decide what age range your story and language usage within the story is written for? Do you write, then your editor or publisher guides you, or is it more fluid than that?
I personally just love the sort of coming of age, 12 years old. I think you should never write down to children. I think, this comes from teaching as well. I think it's important not to write down, and for them to learn new vocabulary, as long as you're very careful with how if you're going to put a complicated word in, to make sure that the context is kind of there to help them. But I just love that age range. I think I love how you can, even for sort of 12-year-olds, you can come up with quite complex stories with, multiple subplots and stuff like that, but you don't have to, it's not quite getting into the adult sphere or the young adult sphere where you have to start adding romance and things like that. So I'm always very, very focused on that age group. I just, that's the kind of, I think it as well, it's one of those age ranges that adults love just as much. If you think about, like his Dark Materials, things like that, it's just, it kind of transcends all those ages, which I think is just a really, really fun thing to write.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think middle grade feels like a space in which anything can happen, and, your readers will just go with it and just be so kind of allow themselves to be swept up in it. And in terms of I think you put it so well, Hannah, the writing down to children is not good, because I think children can really pick up on if they're being patronized. So I think and then if there is a complicated word or a complicated kind of concept, maybe even, then the way it's written.
Exactly. I mean, I'm still learning words from middle grade books all the time.
Yeah, same. The Thesaurus is my favorite book.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And from Linda, she asks, how many drafts did you work through before you reached the one you felt happiest with?
Mine was 7.
Felt like a billion. It's just when they say writing is rewriting, they actually mean that. The first draft is just like a sort of mark making of you kind of got to make sense of it all. I don't know, probably I'd say full redrafts, probably about 3 or 4, but there was lots of like little sort of tweaks going on in between. Yeah, it's really difficult, but you rewrite constantly.
And that's an important message to give to children as well, because they have to learn in their work that they need to to redraft and revise and re-edit. So thank you for that. And then Chris and Viv ask, has anyone you have ever met influenced the nature of your characters?
Mm.
That's a yes from Tamzin.
I could call my lawyer. No, I definitely, and I think that a lot of people, I suppose now, Hannah, I don't know if you get this, but people are now a bit paranoid that they're going to be turned into a villain in one of your books, or it's a kind of superpower we now have of being able to name someone something.
Yeah, the clocks with Edda Finkelstein, that's based on my father. He's really, really creative. He makes, maybe you go into his house, he's made all the furniture, he's got all these different clocks up on the house, on the walls that he's made, tide clocks. He goes to sort of recycling centres and just finds really quirky things and just repurposes them. So when I was writing Edda, her house with all the clocks in, I was very inspired by my dad with that. Yeah.
So cool. Yeah. And then there's just like elements of that element of him. So would he recognize that in?
I think so. Should do.
Cool. That's cool. Yeah. Definitely Sir Hugo for me was inspired by some people.
Yeah.
Not saying who. Yeah.
Thanks. And Elizabeth has asked, this is a question for you, Tamzin. The idea of a magical hat maker reminded me of the main character Sophie in Diana Wynne Jones's Howl's Moving Castle. Is there any connection for you?
Weirdly enough, there isn't. I mean, I love Diana Wynne Jones and I loved Howl's Moving Castle, but weirdly, I totally forgot that she was a hat maker. And I read that book once and I loved it and I sort of devoured it and then almost couldn't remember parts of it. And then I watched the Studio Ghibli version after I'd written The Hat Makers, because I don't know if you've done this, Hannah, but like when you have the initial idea for the book, and you're like, this is amazing, this is so great, like it's magic, and there was this awful moment where I was like, I have to Google to see if it's been done before. And like, it was like my heart was going and I was like Googling to see if The Hat Makers is actually a book that I'd already read and was like, oh, I've just had this amazing idea. But then I saw, so weirdly enough, I had read Howl's Moving Castle years ago, then saw the Studio Ghibli version. And for a moment, I was like probably 3 drafts into The Hat Makers. And I thought, oh no, I've totally stolen this idea. But yeah, then so there's maybe a subliminal connection, but yeah, Howl's Moving Castle is an absolutely beautiful book, and Diana Wynne Jones is just, I love her writing so much. So any comparison anyone would like to make, any please make it.
Please. And Diana has said, I'm so glad that Hana is writing another book with some of the characters. The Eyeball Girl is indeed intriguing, and I'd really like to know what happened to Pieta.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So there we go. Lots of pleas for you to think about it. Ferrelith has said, Tamzin, has your experience in the theatre informed or influenced your pacing of action and dialogue in your writing?
That's a really good question. My experience as an actor, I think, has definitely, I've read a lot of scripts and sort of had a lot of scripts are sort of 90% dialogue, and I love writing dialogue. So I think that has been a big influence, that I really enjoyed writing. And sometimes to me, when I'm writing a scene, the dialogue comes and I'll kind of build the narrative and the description around the dialogue. So I think that's probably definitely influenced me. In terms of the pacing, I don't know really. I think probably. But again, I sort of don't have any hard and fast rules about writing, so it's quite hard to say what's deliberate, but definitely the dialogue element has been influenced by what a lot of the material that I've read over the last 15 years being an actor.
Okay, well, I told by Bev that we have the trailers are working, the sound is now working. So before I draw the evening to a close, we'll just show the 2 trailers so that people can enjoy them with sound.
Join 5 amazing children: Egg, Milu, Sem, Lotta, Fenna, for an adventure packed with puppets, pirate ships, clockmakers, and cruel villains.
Yeah, and actually, before we've had another question come in from Liz. As a teacher myself, this is for both of you. As a teacher myself, I'm curious what single piece of advice you'd give to children about to start a writing project.
Oh gosh,
Single piece is hard.
you've got to really have fun with it. You've got to really enjoy it, I think, is the main thing, and not worry about getting it perfect. You know, if you want to write a book, it's gonna have to take a lot of rewriting. So that first draft is really for you to have a lot of fun and to really go crazy and have some owl poltergeist.
That's a good message. Tamzin, what about you?
Yeah, I think probably similar. Like allow it to be messy and don't try to make it like something else. I think sometimes we think that in order to do something successful, it needs to be like something we've already seen that works. But I think that be original and find your own voice, and definitely have fun. That's more than one piece of advice. Sorry.
Strong piece of advice. So I think at that point it's probably an appropriate moment for me to remind people that they can order a signed copy of both books via the link that Bev is putting up on the site. And there's a special offer if you decide to treat yourself to both. Keep an eye out for our future virtual events. We're going to be doing things in the next month or so with Michelle Paver, with Jen Carney and Katie Kirby, with Anne Booth and David Litchfield. As you may well know, we're doing a whole series of events next week for World Book Day, and we do have some places left on the draw along with Tony DeSaules and with Sally Gardner and Joseph Quilo. Alex Weekle, we may have a small number of children that can see it if anyone is interested, because a couple of schools have revised their numbers down. I always have to say, if you don't want us to keep your details on file so that we can let you know about future events, please email me and I will remove you from our list. And also to remind you, if you haven't already done so, do go to our website and sign up for our newsletters so that you'll know what we're doing. And at that point, I kind of need to say a few thanks. First of all, to Penguin Random House for asking us to host this launch tonight. Thanks, Louise. My thanks to Bev and Naomi, my partners in crime, for helping keep things moving and trying to tame the beast that is Zoom. But a big thank you to all of you for coming tonight and for supporting us generally by booking our authors to come into your schools and libraries and come into these events. But finally, a huge special thanks to Hana and to Tamzin for such great books and for such a great evening. So as this is a celebration, as I said at the beginning, can you switch your mics and cameras on, and can you raise your glasses or your cups of tea or coffee, or and join me in saying to both of you, cheers, congratulations, and I hope that, and I'm sure the books are going to do extremely well for both of you. So cheers, guys.
Cheers.
Yes.
Cheers.
Cheers. Well done. Well done.
Brilliant.
Yay.
Well done.
Thank you very much.